Some loneliness cuts so deep, it changes the shape of your soul. After 23 years talking only to mountain winds and his own echo, Ezra Stone finally admitted what every human heart knows weren't meant to live alone. The weathered trapper left his Montana wilderness and rode into Cedar Ridge, hoping the frontier town might offer him what his isolated cabin never could. He came looking for companionship, maybe even love. When he met Sarah Mitchell, a widowed schoolteacher carrying her own grief, their worlds collided in ways neither expected. She saw past his rough exterior to the gentle heart beneath. He reminded her that hope could bloom again after loss. Together, they discovered something more precious than either had imagined. But would a refined woman ever truly accept a life with a man whose only companions had been mountain peaks and winter storms? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn sun cast long shadows across Cedar Ridge's main thoroughfare as Ezra Stone guided his paint horse down the dusty street. 23 years of mountain living had shaped him into something both wild and gentle, broad shoulders that could carry a winter's worth of firewood, hands scarred by axe and trap, yet eyes that held the patient kindness of a man who'd learned to read the subtle language of seasons and storms. His beard, streaked with premature silver, framed a face weathered by wind and solitude, but unmarked by the hardness that bitter men wore. He sat his saddle with the easy grace of someone more comfortable on horseback than on foot, more at home under open sky than beneath any roof. The buckskin jacket across his shoulders had seen countless seasons, patched and mended until it fit him like a second skin. Cedar Ridge bustled with the kind of purposeful energy that mountain peaks never possessed. Wagons rattled past, loaded with lumber from the mills, their drivers calling greetings to friends and neighbors. Women in calico dresses swept stoops and tended gardens, their children playing hopscotch in the street dirt. The scent of fresh bread drifted from the bakery, mingling with sawdust from the carpenter's shop and the earthy smell of horses from the livery stable. Ezra had forgotten how loud civilization could be. Not just the sound-shammering, conversation, laughter, but the sheer presence of so many lives intersecting, each person carrying their own bundle of hopes and troubles. After decades of silence broken only by wind through pines and the occasional call of a hawk, the constant hum of human activity felt overwhelming. He dismounted outside Patterson's general store, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The worn leather of his boots met the wooden boardwalk with a soft thud that seemed unnaturally loud to his ears. Through the store's dusty window, he could see shelves lined with goods he'd learned to live without: bolts of cloth, sacks of flour, jars of preserves. Simple luxuries that mountain life had taught him to view as unnecessary, yet now represented the possibility of a different kind of existence. The store's bell chimed as he pushed through the door, and conversations paused as heads turned his way. He wasn't the first mountain man to wander into Cedar Ridge, but something about him, perhaps the gentleness in his eyes, or the way he removed his hat with old-fashioned courtesy, marked him as different from the rough trappers who occasionally passed through town, seeking supplies. "Whiskey. Help you with something?" The storekeeper, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, studied Ezra with cautious curiosity. "Need some basic supplies," Ezra replied, his voice rusty from disuse but warm in tone. "Coffee, flour, salt, nothing fancy." As he moved through the store, gathering items he'd need for however long he planned to stay, other customers observed him with the polite interest small towns reserved for newcomers. He was aware of their scrutiny but not uncomfortable with it. Mountain life had taught him patience, and he understood that trust, like trust between a man and a wild animal, had to be earned gradually. 3 blocks away, Sarah Mitchell stood before her classroom's single window, watching dust motes dance in the afternoon light. The one-room schoolhouse had been her world for the past 2 years, a place where she could lose herself in the simple joy of watching young minds discover letters and numbers. 26 years old, but feeling decades older, She carried herself with the composed dignity of a woman who'd learned to find strength in responsibility. Her dark hair, pinned back in a practical bun, couldn't quite contain the rebellious curls that escaped to frame her face. She wore a simple blue dress, well-made but not fancy, that spoke of careful economy and sensible choices. Her hands, soft but capable, bore the faint stains of chalk and ink badges of her profession that she wore with quiet pride. The music box on her desk caught the light, its polished wood gleaming like a small treasure among the scattered papers and primers. Henry had given it to her during their courtship, and it still played the sweet melody that had once filled their little house with promise. Now it sat silent, a beautiful reminder of a happiness that felt like something she'd read about in a book rather than lived herself. Her students had gone home an hour ago, their voices and laughter fading into the distance like birdsong at dusk. The empty classroom felt peaceful in the way that only familiar spaces could. Here, surrounded by slates and readers and the faint scent of wood smoke from the pot-bellied stove, she could almost pretend that her life was full enough, that teaching other people's children could satisfy the maternal longings she tried so hard to ignore. Sarah? The voice belonged to her father, Judge Mitchell, whose footsteps on the schoolhouse porch announced his daily visit to walk her home. At 63, he remained sharp and distinguished, his silver hair and formal bearing commanding respect throughout the territory. Since Henry's death, he'd appointed himself her protector, a role that sometimes felt more like gentle imprisonment. "Just finishing up, Papa." She turned from the window, smoothing her skirts with automatic precision. The music box caught her eye again, and she found herself touching its lid with fingertips that remembered the joy it once brought. Outside Patterson's store, Ezra secured his purchases to his saddle with practiced efficiency. The paint horse, a reliable companion named Scout, nuzzled his shoulder with the familiarity of long partnership. They traveled many miles together, through mountain passes and hidden valleys, but never toward anything as uncertain as the hope that had brought them to Cedar Ridge. The town's rhythm was beginning to make sense to him. He could see the Patton's children released from school, merchants preparing to close their shops, men heading home to supper and families. It was the kind of life he'd imagined during long winter evenings in his cabin, when the silence grew so complete it felt like a living thing pressing against his chest. As he walked Scout toward the livery stable, he noticed a woman emerging from the schoolhouse, accompanied by an older gentleman in a dark suit. Something about her bearing, straight-backed but not rigid, purposeful but not hurried, caught his attention. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone comfortable with her place in the world, yet there was something in her careful composure that spoke of held-back sorrow. Their eyes met across the dusty street for just a moment, and Ezra felt something shift in his chest, like ice cracking on a spring river. She had the kind of face that belonged in candlelight, gentle and intelligent, with eyes that seemed to hold depths he could spend a lifetime exploring. When she looked away, continuing her conversation with the distinguished gentleman beside her, Ezra found himself wondering what her voice sounded like, and whether she ever smiled with the kind of abandon that mountain sunrises sometimes inspired. Sarah felt the stranger's gaze like a physical touch, warm and respectful but unmistakably interested. She'd grown skilled at deflecting the attention of men who saw her widowhood as an opportunity, but this felt different, less predatory, more wondering. When she glanced his way, she saw a man who looked like he belonged in wild places, yet carried himself with an unexpected gentleness that made her curious despite herself. "Who's that?" she asked her father quietly, nodding toward the tall figure leading his horse toward the livery. Judge Mitchell followed her gaze and frowned slightly. "Don't know. Mountain man, by the look of him. Probably just passing through." His tone carried the subtle disapproval he reserved for anything that might disrupt the carefully ordered life he'd constructed for his daughter since Henry's death. But as they walked home together, Sarah found herself glancing back over her shoulder, wondering about the stranger, with the gentle eyes and the patient way he handled his horse. In a town where she knew everyone's story, where her days followed predictable patterns, The presence of someone truly unknown felt like the first breath of spring after a long, cold winter. Behind them, the music box sat silent on her desk, waiting for hands that might one day wind it again. The morning started like any other, with Sarah leading her 12 students on their weekly nature walk to the meadow beyond town. The crisp October air carried the scent of dying leaves and wood smoke, and the children chatted excitedly as they searched for specimens to press between the pages of their readers. "Miss Mitchell, look what I found!" 8-year-old Tommy Brennan held up a perfectly formed acorn, his freckled face bright with discovery. Sarah smiled at his enthusiasm, remembering how Henry used to collect such treasures during their own walks through the woods. "That's beautiful, Tommy. We'll add it to our collection when we get back." She adjusted the slate board under her arm, the one they used for outdoor lessons, sketching leaves and practicing their letters in the dirt. The children scattered across the meadow like dandelion seeds, their voices rising and falling with each new discovery. Sarah counted heads automatically, a habit born of responsibility and care. Mary Beth and her sister Susan were gathering wildflowers near the creek. The Miller twins were examining something in the grass. Little Emma was... "Tommy?" Sarah's voice cut through the morning air. She counted again, her heart beginning to race. 11 children, 1 missing. "Tommy Brennan," she called, trying to keep the panic from her voice. The other children looked up, suddenly aware that something was wrong. "He was just here," Mary Beth said, pointing toward a stand of pine trees at the meadow's edge. "He said he saw something shiny in the woods." Sarah's blood turned cold. Everyone in Cedar Ridge knew about the abandoned mineshafts that dotted the hills, relics from the gold rush days when men had dug holes like hungry gophers, seeking fortune in the earth. Most had been sealed or marked, but in the dense woods, a curious child could easily stumble into danger. "Children, stay exactly where you are," she commanded, her teacher's voice brooking no argument. "Mary Beth, take your sister and run back to town. Tell Sheriff Watson that Tommy is missing in the woods near the old mining claims." As the older girl gathered her siblings and ran toward town, Sarah plunged into the tree line, calling Tommy's name. The forest seemed to swallow her voice, giving back only the whisper of wind through branches and the distant call of a crow. Every shadow could hide a pit, every cluster of fallen leaves could conceal a shaft opening. 20 minutes that felt like hours passed before she heard the sound of approaching horses. Sheriff Watson arrived with half a dozen men, their faces grim with understanding of what an 8-year-old boy could encounter in these woods. "How long has he been missing?" Watson asked, dismounting with the urgency of a man who'd seen too many tragedies. "Nearly an hour now," Sarah's voice caught slightly. "He was looking for something shiny. I should have been watching more carefully." "This isn't your fault," a deep voice interrupted. Sarah turned to see the mountain man from yesterday approaching on foot, his paint horse ground, tied behind him. Up close, she could see the concern etched in the lines around his eyes, the way his hands already moved with the purposeful economy of someone preparing for action. "Ezra Stone," he said simply, touching his hat brim in acknowledgement. "Heard the commotion from the livery. I know these woods." Sheriff Watson looked skeptical. "Appreciate the offer, but we've got men who've lived here their whole lives." "Have they spent 23 years reading sign and tracking game?" Ezra's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the gentleness. "That boy's been gone over an hour. Every minute matters." Sarah stepped forward, her teacher's instinct for reading character overriding social convention. Something in this stranger's eyes, a deep understanding of how quickly the wilderness could turn, dangerous, convinced her he might be Tommy's best hope. "Please," she said, looking directly at Ezra, "help us find him." Ezra nodded once and knelt at the spot where Tommy had last been seen. His fingers traced patterns in the disturbed earth that meant nothing to the other men but told him a clear story. Small boot prints heading northeast toward the thickest stand of trees, broken twigs at child height, a scrap of brown cloth caught on a branch the same color as Tommy's jacket. "He went this way," Ezra said, rising and starting into the woods without waiting for the others, moving fast, excited about something. The search party followed, crashing through underbrush with the well-meaning clumsiness of men unaccustomed to moving quietly in wild places. Sarah stayed close behind Ezra, mesmerized by the way he seemed to read the forest like a familiar book. A bent twig here, a disturbed patch of moss there, each sign building a picture of Tommy's path. "There," Ezra said suddenly, pointing to a depression in the earth, partially hidden by fallen logs. "Old mine shaft. Covers rotted through." They rushed to the opening, and Sarah's heart nearly stopped when she heard a faint cry echoing from the darkness below. "Tommy! Tommy, can you hear me?" she called. "Miss Mitchell." The voice was thin and frightened, but blessedly alive. "I can't get out. My leg hurts." Sheriff Watson peered into the shaft, his face grave. "It's a good 15 feet down, maybe more. We'll need ropes and—" "No time for that," Ezra said quietly. He was already removing his jacket and testing the strength of the logs that formed the shaft's partial covering. "Kid's scared and probably hurt. Longer he stays down there, the worse it gets." Before anyone could protest, Ezra had fashioned a makeshift harness from his belt and rope, securing it around his waist. He looked at Sarah, and for a moment she saw past his calm exterior to the genuine care beneath. "I'll bring him up," he promised. The descent took only minutes, but to Sarah it felt like an eternity. She knelt at the shaft opening, listening to Ezra's calm voice, reassuring Tommy, explaining what they were going to do, keeping the frightened boy focused on getting home safe. "All right, son, we're going to take this slow and easy," Ezra's voice echoed from the darkness. "You just hold on tight to me, and we'll be topside before you know it." When Ezra's head appeared at the shaft opening, Tommy clinging to his back like a small monkey, Sarah felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. The other men hauled them both to safety, and Sarah immediately knelt beside the boy, checking him for injuries. "Just a twisted ankle," Ezra said, gently helping Tommy sit against a tree trunk. "You're going to be fine, young man. But next time you go exploring, make sure you tell someone where you're headed." Tommy nodded solemnly, his earlier fright giving way to the excitement of having survived an adventure. "Yes, sir. Thank you for getting me out of there." As Sheriff Watson organized the journey back to town, Sarah found herself standing beside Ezra, struggling to find words adequate to her gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," she began. "No thanks needed." He retrieved his jacket and shrugged it on, his movements betraying a slight stiffness that suggested the rescue had cost him more effort than he'd let show. "Just glad the boy's safe. You have children of your own?" The question slipped out before Sarah could stop it, and she immediately felt heat rise to her cheeks at her boldness. Ezra's expression grew distant for a moment. "No, ma'am. Never had that privilege." He looked at Tommy, who was now recounting his adventure to the other men, with the resilience of childhood. "But every child deserves someone looking out for them." As they walked back through the woods toward town, Sarah found herself studying this gentle stranger who'd appeared in their lives like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known she was praying. The way he'd spoken to Tommy, patient, reassuring, treating the boy's fear with the same seriousness he'd given adults concern, revealed a natural understanding of children that couldn't be taught. Behind them, the slate board lay forgotten in the meadow grass, its smooth surface reflecting the sky like a small dark mirror waiting to be written upon. The letters arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by the weekly mail coach in a bundle tied with familiar blue ribbon. Sarah recognized her sister Catherine's careful penmanship immediately, and her heart sank as she broke the wax seal. Catherine's letters always carried the same underlying message, wrapped in sisterly concern but sharp as a blade nonetheless. "My dearest Sarah," the letter began, "I pray this finds you in good health and spirits, though I confess I worry constantly about your situation. 2 years is long enough to mourn, dear sister. Henry would not want you to spend your life in that dreary frontier town, wasting away among other people's children when you could have a family of your own." Sarah set the letter aside and walked to her kitchen window, where morning light streamed across the simple wooden table Henry had built during their brief marriage. Catherine meant well, but her sister's comfortable life in San Francisco, married to a successful merchant, surrounded by society and culture, made it difficult for her to understand the peace Sarah had found in Cedar Ridge's simplicity. The letter continued with news of suitable gentlemen Catherine had met at various social functions, each one apparently eager to provide for a refined widow willing to relocate. The descriptions blurred together successful, established, proper words that should have appealed to a woman in Sarah's position, but instead left her feeling hollow. She was still holding the unopened bundle when a knock at her door interrupted her brooding. Through the lace curtain, she could see Richard Wesley's familiar silhouette, and she suppressed a sigh before opening the door. "Good morning, Sarah." Richard removed his hat with practiced courtesy, revealing carefully pomaded hair that never seemed to suffer a strand out of place. At 28, he possessed the kind of conventional handsomeness that mothers approved of: regular features, clear skin, and the well-fed look of prosperity. His father owned the town's largest bank, and Richard served as its manager, a position that afforded him both respect and financial security. "Richard, this is unexpected." Sarah remained in the doorway, not inviting him in. Their friendship had grown increasingly awkward since he'd begun making his intentions clear, and she found his visits more burden than pleasure. "I wanted to discuss the Harvest Festival with you. As members of the planning committee, we should coordinate our efforts." His smile was practiced, confident, in the way of men accustomed to getting what they wanted through persistence and social pressure. "Of course." Sarah stepped aside reluctantly, gesturing him toward the sitting room, "though I'm not sure what coordination is needed. The festival plans seem well in hand." Richard settled into Henry's favorite chair without invitation, a presumption that always irritated Sarah. He'd been making such small claims on her space and time for months, each one seemingly insignificant, but collectively creating an assumption of intimacy she'd never encouraged. "Actually, I hoped we might attend together," he said, his tone suggesting the matter was already decided. "It would be proper for us to arrive as a couple, given our positions in the community." "Our positions?" Sarah kept her voice carefully neutral, though her fingers tightened on Catherine's letters. "Come now, Sarah. Surely you realize that people expect certain things. You're a respectable widow. I'm an eligible bachelor from a good family. It's natural that we would—" "Natural?" The word came out sharper than Sarah intended. "What's natural about assumptions made without consultation?" Richard's smile never wavered, but she caught a flash of annoyance in his eyes. "I'm simply being practical. You need security. I need a wife. We're both educated, both from good families. It's a sensible match." The casual way he reduced their potential marriage to a business transaction made Sarah's skin crawl. She thought of Henry, who'd courted her with wildflowers and poetry, who'd seen her not as a solution to a social problem, but as a woman worthy of passionate love. "I appreciate your concern for my security," she said carefully, "but I'm quite capable of managing my own affairs." "Are you?" Richard leaned forward, his expression growing serious. "Sarah, you're living on a teacher's salary in a frontier town. Your father won't live forever, and then what? You'll be a spinster at 30, with no family, no prospects. I'm offering you respectability, comfort, a real home." Before Sarah could respond, another knock interrupted them. Through the window, she saw Ezra Stone standing on her porch, hat in hand, looking distinctly uncomfortable. Her pulse quickened inexplicably. "Excuse me," she said to Richard, rising to answer the door. "Ma'am," Ezra said quietly when she opened it. "Sorry to disturb you. Just wanted to check on young Tommy, see how he's recovering from yesterday." "That's very kind of you." Sarah felt genuinely warmed by his concern. "He's doing well. His mother says he's been telling everyone in town about his adventure." "Good to hear." Ezra's gaze moved past her to Richard, who had risen and was studying the mountain man with obvious displeasure. "I can come back another time if you're busy." "Not at all," Sarah said quickly, stepping back to admit him. "Please, come in." "Richard Wesley, this is Ezra Stone. Mr. Stone is the one who rescued Tommy yesterday." Richard's handshake was brief and cool. "Yes, I heard about that. Very heroic." His tone suggested he found the whole affair somewhat overblown. Just doing what needed doing, Ezra replied mildly, but Sarah noticed how he positioned himself, relaxed but balanced, like a man ready to move quickly if necessary. Mr. Stone has been looking for work in town, Sarah continued, filling the awkward silence. Perhaps the bank knows of opportunities. I'm afraid not, Richard said without consideration. Most established businesses prefer employees with proper references, background that can be verified. The slight was subtle but unmistakable, and Sarah felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment for Richard's rudeness. Ezra's expression didn't change, but she caught a tightening around his eyes that suggested the barb had found its mark. Actually, Sarah said impulsively, Mr. Patterson mentioned he might need help at the lumber mill. The work is honest, and they value skill over social connections. That's kind of you, ma'am. Ezra's voice carried gratitude that made her feel both pleased and defensive. I'll speak with him. Well, Richard said, rising abruptly, I should be going. Sarah, we'll continue our conversation later. He paused at the door, his gaze moving between Sarah and Ezra with obvious calculation. Perhaps at the harvest festival. After he left, the room felt somehow lighter, as if Richard had taken some oppressive weight with him. Sarah found herself studying Ezra, noting the way he held himself in her civilized parlor, careful not to touch anything, aware of his rough appearance among her feminine furnishings, yet somehow more genuine than Richard had ever seemed. I hope I didn't cause problems, Ezra said quietly. Didn't realize you had company. No problems, Sarah assured him. Richard often assumes more familiarity than exists. Ezra nodded, understanding more than she'd said. Some men mistake persistence for affection. The observation was so accurate it startled her. You see clearly for someone who's lived alone for 23 years. Solitude teaches you to watch and listen. People reveal themselves in small ways if you pay attention. Sarah found herself curious about what he saw when he looked at her. What small revelations she might be unconsciously offering. The thought should have made her self-conscious, but instead she felt oddly understood. The mill work, she said hesitantly. It's hard labor, physical. I'm not afraid of hard work, ma'am. Spent my life working with my hands. Of course, I didn't mean to suggest. She stopped, flustered by her own awkwardness. I only meant that you seem, that is, you speak like an educated man. Ezra's smile transformed his weathered features. My mother was a schoolteacher. Made sure I knew my letters and numbers before I ever learned to set a trap. The revelation surprised her. She'd assumed his gentleness was natural rather than learned, his careful speech the result of thoughtfulness rather than education. The knowledge that he'd been shaped by a woman like herself created an unexpected connection. She would be proud, Sarah said softly, to see how her son turned out. For a moment, Ezra's composed mask slipped, revealing something vulnerable beneath. I hope so, ma'am. I surely hope so. Sunday morning found Cedar Ridge's small church filled with the usual congregation of familiar faces, their voices joining in hymns that had comforted generations of frontier families. Sarah sat in her customary pew, third row from the front, her father beside her in his dignified black suit. The routine of worship had become a cornerstone of her week, a time when the weight of daily responsibilities seemed to lift. Pastor Mackenzie was midway through his sermon about the Good Samaritan when the church door opened with a soft creak. Sarah glanced back automatically and felt her breath catch. Ezra Stone stood in the doorway, hat in hand, his Sunday clothes clean but clearly the best of a limited wardrobe. His hair had been carefully combed, his beard trimmed, and his boots polished to a respectable shine. A murmur rippled through the congregation as heads turned to assess the newcomer. Ezra's discomfort was visible in the tension of his shoulders, the way his fingers worked, the brim of his hat, but his expression remained calm as he scanned the packed pews for an empty space. Mrs. Henderson, ever the town's unofficial social coordinator, gestured toward a spot in the back row, and Ezra made his way there with quiet dignity. Sarah found herself watching him settle into the hard wooden pew, noting how he followed the service with genuine attention despite his obvious unfamiliarity with the ritual. When Pastor Mackenzie asked the congregation to turn to Psalm 23, Sarah saw Ezra fumble briefly with the worn Bible he'd brought, his fingers searching for the correct passage. Without thinking, she held up her own book, showing him the page number. Their eyes met across the rows of worshippers, and his grateful nod sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. His voice, when he joined the responsive reading, carried clear and strong. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." The words seemed to hold special meaning for him, and Sarah wondered what valleys he had walked through during his years alone in the mountains. After the service, as the congregation filed out into the crisp autumn morning, Sarah watched the tentative interactions between Ezra and her neighbors. The men were polite but reserved, still measuring this stranger against their own standards. The women were curious, whispering among themselves about his appearance, his manners, his obvious attempt to fit into their civilized gathering. Sarah. Her father's voice carried a note of warning as he noticed her attention focused on the mountain man. "Walk with me." They moved down the church steps together, Judge Mitchell nodding to friends and colleagues with practiced political grace. Sarah had learned to read her father's moods in the set of his jaw, the pace of his stride, and today she could tell he was troubled. "Papa." "The man's making quite an impression." Judge Mitchell interrupted, his tone carefully neutral. "Rescued the Brennan boy, found work at the mill, now attending church. Very thorough." "Thorough?" Sarah stopped walking, stung by his implication. "He saved a child's life. Is that calculated?" "I'm not questioning his motives in that instance," her father replied carefully. "But a man doesn't suddenly appear in a town, perform a heroic rescue, and begin courting respectability without purpose." The word courting made Sarah's cheeks warm. No one is courting anyone. He's simply trying to become part of the community. Judge Mitchell studied his daughter's face with the shrewd eyes that had served him well on the territorial bench. "Sarah, you're a beautiful woman and a catch for any man. But you're also vulnerable, and men like that." He nodded toward Ezra, who was speaking quietly with Pastor Mackenzie near the church door. "Men like that understand how to appeal to a woman's sympathies." "Men like what?" Sarah's voice carried more heat than she'd intended. "Good men, kind men, men who risk their own safety to help others. Men with no past, no references, no family connections, men who appear from nowhere and expect to be trusted." Judge Mitchell's expression softened slightly. "Darling, I know you miss Henry. I know you're lonely, but desperation makes poor foundation for judgment." The accusation hit Sarah like a physical blow. "I am not desperate." "No? Then why are you so defensive about a man you barely know?" Sarah had no answer for that, because the truth was too complicated to explain even to herself. She didn't know why Ezra Stone's presence seemed to awaken something in her that had been sleeping since Henry's death. She didn't understand why his quiet strength made Richard Wesley's confident presumptions seem hollow by comparison. "He's a good man, Papa. I can see it. And I hope you're right. But seeing and knowing are different things. Promise me you'll be careful." Before Sarah could respond, a commotion near the church steps drew their attention. Tommy Brennan had broken away from his parents and was running toward Ezra, his face bright with excitement. "Mr. Stone! Mr. Stone!" The boy skidded to a halt in front of his rescuer, practically bouncing with enthusiasm. "Mama says I can invite you to Sunday dinner if you want to come." Ezra knelt to the boy's level, bringing their faces into alignment with the natural grace Sarah was beginning to recognize as characteristic. "That's mighty kind of your mama, son. You sure she won't mind an extra mouth at her table? She said it's the least we can do for the man who brought me home safe." Tommy's earnestness was touching. "Please say yes." Sarah watched Ezra's face, saw the genuine pleasure that crossed his features at the simple invitation. When had someone last invited him to share a family meal? When had he last sat at a table, surrounded by conversation and laughter, instead of mountain silence? "Well then," Ezra said, rising and extending his hand to shake Tommy's small one formally, "I accept. Thank you for the invitation." As the Brennan family enveloped Ezra in their grateful warmth, leading him away toward their modest home, Sarah felt an unexpected pang of something that might have been envy. Not of the attention he was receiving, but of the simple human connection, the belonging that she saw in his expression as he walked away, surrounded by new friends. "You see," Judge Mitchell said quietly beside her, "he's already building alliances, making himself indispensable." But Sarah saw something different in the scene before her. She saw a man who'd spent decades alone, discovering what it meant to be welcomed, to be valued, not for what he could provide, but for who he was. The wonder in Ezra's face, as Tommy chatted beside him, wasn't calculation. It was the genuine amazement of someone experiencing community for the first time in 23 years. That afternoon, while her father napped and the town settled into Sunday's peaceful rhythm, Sarah found herself walking toward the schoolhouse. She often spent Sunday afternoons there, preparing lessons and enjoying the quiet solitude of her classroom. But today, she carried her Bible and a wildflower she'd picked from the meadow behind her house, a late-blooming aster, purple and resilient. She pressed the flower between the pages of Psalms, near the passage they'd read that morning. It seemed important somehow to preserve this small piece of beauty, this reminder of a day when a stranger had stood in their church and spoken words about walking through valleys without fear. The pressed flower would dry there between the sacred pages, becoming part of the story she was slowly beginning to understand, a story about faith and second chances, about the courage required to step out of familiar shadows and into uncertain light. As evening approached and the church bells chimed the hour, Sarah walked home through streets that seemed somehow different than they had that morning. The same houses lined the dusty road, the same neighbors tended their gardens, but something fundamental had shifted in her perception of Cedar Ridge and her place within it. Perhaps it was seeing Ezra Stone struggle with unfamiliar hymn pages and finding the courage to stand among strangers who might judge him. Perhaps it was witnessing the Brennan family's grateful welcome, their simple recognition that goodness deserved acknowledgement regardless of social station. Or perhaps it was her father's warning, which had forced her to examine feelings she'd been trying to ignore. Whatever the cause, Sarah Mitchell went to sleep that Sunday night, with a pressed wildflower in her Bible and a question in her heart that she wasn't yet ready to answer. 3 weeks after Tommy's rescue, Sarah found herself lingering at the schoolhouse well past her usual departure time. The excuse was lesson planning, but the truth was more complicated. From her classroom window, she could see the lumber mill where Ezra had found steady work, and she'd developed the unconscious habit of watching for his tall figure among the workers heading home at day's end. Today, however, he appeared at her door instead of passing by on the street. His knock was soft, respectful, and when she opened it, she found him holding his hat and looking uncertain. "Ma'am, I hope I'm not disturbing you. I wanted to ask about young Emma Patterson. She seemed troubled during church on Sunday." Sarah's heart warmed at his observation. Emma, the storekeeper's shy daughter, often struggled with the confidence to speak up in class or social situations. That Ezra had noticed her distress spoke to the gentle attention he paid to others. "Emma's been having difficulties since her mother died last spring," Sarah explained, stepping aside to let him enter the classroom. "Her father means well, but he's overwhelmed managing the store and caring for a 9-year-old girl." Ezra nodded, his gaze moving around the schoolroom with interest. Losing a mother at that age. He paused, and Sarah sensed he was drawing from his own experience. It leaves a child feeling adrift, like they don't quite belong anywhere. "You speak as though you understand. I was 10 when my mother passed. Fever took her one winter." Ezra's voice was matter-of-fact, but Sarah heard the old pain beneath his calm words. "My father was a good man, but he didn't know how to comfort a grieving boy. I suppose that's part of why I took to the mountains, felt more at home with trees and sky than with people." The revelation offered Sarah a glimpse into the loneliness that had shaped him. "What helped you, eventually?" "Time, mostly, and understanding that losing someone doesn't mean you stop loving them. It just means you carry that love differently." He looked at her directly then, and she felt the weight of his attention. Maybe that's something Emma needs to hear. Sarah found herself studying his face, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of sorrow weathered into wisdom. You're very perceptive for someone who's lived alone so long. Solitude teaches you to think deeply about things. When you don't have conversation to distract you, you tend to examine your own heart pretty thoroughly. There was something in his tone that made Sarah brave enough to ask, "And what did you find there?" Ezra was quiet for a long moment, his fingers turning his hat brim. Longing mostly, and regret for time wasted being afraid. Afraid of what? Of being hurt again, of trusting someone enough to let them matter. His eyes met hers, and Sarah felt her breath catch at the vulnerability she saw there. Funny thing about fear, it protects you from pain, but it also keeps you from joy. The words hung between them like a bridge, neither was quite ready to cross. Sarah felt the truth of them resonate in her own chest, where Henry's wedding ring still rested on a chain beneath her dress, hidden but ever present. "I should let you get home," Ezra said finally, moving toward the door. "Just wanted to mention Emma. Maybe if she knew someone else understood about losing a mother." "Wait." Sarah spoke before she could stop herself. "Would you? That is, I was thinking of organizing a small gathering. Some of the children who might benefit from extra attention. Perhaps Saturday afternoon. Nothing formal, just stories and maybe some simple refreshments. You want me to come? If you're willing, I think your presence might help Emma, and the other children clearly enjoy your company." She paused, then added more quietly, "And I think you enjoy theirs." Ezra's smile was slow but genuine. "Yes, ma'am, I surely do." After he left, Sarah sat at her desk and opened the drawer where she kept Henry's letters. She hadn't read them in months, but tonight she felt the need to hear his voice again, to remember what love had felt like when it was new and uncomplicated. "My dearest Sarah," one letter began, "I find myself counting the hours until I can see you again. Is this what happiness feels like? This constant lightness, as though my feet barely touch the ground." Henry's words, once a source of comfort, now felt like echoes from another life. She could remember the feelings he described, but they seemed distant, like memories of childhood rather than experiences she might have again. She replaced the letters and instead pulled out the chain that held his wedding ring. The gold was warm from resting against her skin, worn smooth by her unconscious habit of touching it when she felt uncertain or afraid. Henry had placed it on her finger with such hope, such certainty, that their future would unfold in predictable happiness. But life, Sarah had learned, rarely followed the paths people planned for it. Saturday afternoon arrived, crisp and clear, with the kind of autumn light that made everything seem touched with gold. Sarah had arranged the schoolroom for their small gathering, moving desks aside to create a circle where the children could sit comfortably. She'd prepared simple treats cookies and apple cider and selected a few of her favorite books to share. Emma arrived first, clinging to her father's hand with the wide-eyed nervousness that had become her constant expression since her mother's death. Mr. Patterson looked grateful but harried, clearly uncertain about leaving his daughter in what he probably saw as an unnecessary social situation. "She'll be fine," Sarah assured him. "We're just going to tell stories and enjoy each other's company." Tommy Brennan bounded through the door next, his earlier adventure having transformed him into something of a local celebrity among his peers. Two of the Miller children followed, along with shy Mary Watson, whose stutter had improved dramatically under Sarah's patient encouragement. When Ezra appeared in the doorway, the children's faces lit up with genuine pleasure. In the weeks since Tommy's rescue, he'd become a figure of fascination and respect among Cedar Ridge's young people. His presence at church and around town had gradually familiarized them with his gentle manner and quiet strength. "Mr. Stone," Tommy called out, "Miss Mitchell said you might tell us about living in the mountains." "Did she now?" Ezra glanced at Sarah with amusement. "Well, I suppose I might have a story or two to share." As the afternoon unfolded, Sarah watched Ezra work his quiet magic with the children. He spoke of winter storms that could bury a cabin to its roofline, of following animal tracks through snow so deep it required snowshoes to navigate. He described the cathedral silence of mountain forests and the way dawn light painted snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. But it was when he spoke to Emma directly that Sarah felt her heart catch in her throat. "I lost my mother when I was about your age," he said gently, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from shared experience. The hardest part wasn't missing her, though that hurt plenty. The hardest part was feeling like I didn't fit anywhere anymore. Emma nodded, her eyes wide and serious. "But you know what I learned? She didn't really leave me. All the things she taught me, all the love she gave me that stayed right here." He touched his chest lightly. "And every time I do something kind or brave or good, it's like she's still with me, helping me be the person she wanted me to become." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she watched Emma's posture subtly straighten, her expression shift from lost to thoughtful. In a few simple words, Ezra had given the child something Sarah's careful lessons and gentle encouragement hadn't been able to provide, the understanding that came from someone who had walked the same difficult path. When the gathering ended and the children had gone home with stories to tell their families, Sarah found herself alone with Ezra in the quiet schoolroom. The late afternoon light slanted through the windows, casting everything in warm gold. "Thank you," she said simply. "What you said to Emma, that was exactly what she needed to hear. Sometimes the only thing that helps is knowing you're not alone in your struggle." Sarah looked at him, this man who'd spent 23 years alone but somehow retained such deep understanding of human connection. "Is that why you came to Cedar Ridge? Because you were tired of struggling alone?" Ezra was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I came because I finally realized that being afraid of getting hurt was hurting me more than any pain someone else could cause." The honesty in his words touched something deep in Sarah's chest, the place where she'd kept her own fears carefully locked away since Henry's death. She felt the weight of his ring against her skin, felt the familiar urge to retreat into the safety of her grief. But she also felt something else, tentative warmth, like the first hint of spring after a long winter. October's crisp promise gave way to November's bitter warning as an early winter storm swept down from the mountains, trapping Cedar Ridge beneath 3 feet of unexpected snow. What had begun as a normal Tuesday morning transformed into a crisis when the weekly supply wagons, loaded with provisions essential for the town's survival through the harsh months ahead, became stranded in the mountain passes. Sarah woke to a world transformed, her windows frosted with ice patterns that spoke of temperatures far below normal for the season. The silence outside was profound, not the gentle quiet of a typical snowfall, but the muffled stillness that comes when nature displays its overwhelming power. By midday, word had spread throughout the town that the supply train was trapped somewhere in Devil's Canyon, a treacherous passage that even experienced drivers avoided during winter weather. The wagons carried not just luxuries but necessities, medicine, flour, sugar, warm clothing, ordered months in advance. Without those supplies, Cedar Ridge faced the possibility of genuine hardship before spring's return. Sheriff Watson called an emergency meeting at the church, the only building large enough to accommodate the worried crowd that gathered as news of their situation spread. Sarah sat with her father in their usual pew, watching familiar faces etched with concern as the sheriff outlined their predicament. "We've got maybe 2 weeks of supplies, if we're careful," Watson announced, his gravelly voice carrying clearly through the cold air. "The storm's supposed to break tomorrow, but those passes will be dangerous for days, maybe weeks." "What about sending a rescue party?" asked Mr. Patterson, clearly thinking of his store's depleted shelves. "I won't ask men to risk their lives for supplies," Watson replied firmly. "Those canyons are death traps in this weather. One wrong step, one hidden crevasse, and we lose good men, along with any hope of reaching those wagons." As voices rose in worried discussion, Sarah noticed movement near the back of the church. Ezra Stone had slipped in quietly during the sheriff's announcement, and now he stood listening with the focused attention she'd come to recognize as characteristic. His weathered face showed no emotion, but she could see him evaluating, calculating, weighing options, with the methodical care of someone accustomed to survival decisions. There might be another way. Ezra's voice wasn't loud, but something in its tone cut through the general hubbub, drawing every eye to where he stood. The church fell silent as neighbors turned to look at the mountain man who'd become familiar, but was still, in many ways, unknown. "I know those passes," he continued, moving forward until he stood in the center aisle. "Spent 23 years learning every trail, every safe route through those mountains. The main road might be impassable, but there are old game trails, routes the Blackfoot used before we ever built roads. Dangerous in this weather, but possible for someone who knows where to step." Sheriff Watson frowned. "Even if such trails exist, you're talking about a journey that could take days. Alone, in this cold." "Not alone." Ezra's interruption was quiet, but firm. "I'll need 2 good men, experienced with horses and snow travel. Men willing to trust my judgment about where we go and how we get there." "This is madness." Richard Wesley spoke up from his seat near the front. "We can't risk lives on the word of a—" He caught himself before finishing the sentence, but his meaning was clear enough. "On the word of what, Richard?" Judge Mitchell's voice carried the authority of his position and the steel of barely controlled anger. "A man who spent more time in those mountains than the rest of us combined." Sarah watched her father with surprise. Since Ezra's arrival, Judge Mitchell had been cautious, even suspicious. This public defense was unexpected and deeply significant. "I'm not questioning Mr. Stone's knowledge," Richard backpedaled smoothly. "I'm simply suggesting that desperation shouldn't drive us to foolish risks." "And I'm suggesting," Judge Mitchell replied coldly, "that we listen to the only man in this room who might actually know how to reach those wagons." Ezra raised his hand slightly, quieting the tension that had begun to crackle through the church. "Judge Mitchell, I appreciate your confidence, but Mr. Wesley isn't wrong about the risks. This won't be a Sunday ride. We'll be traveling through country that can kill a man in a dozen different ways, in weather that shows no mercy for mistakes." He paused, his gaze moving slowly around the congregation, meeting eyes, weighing faces. "I'm willing to try because I've walked those trails in every season, every kind of weather. But I won't ask any man to follow me who isn't completely certain he understands what we're facing. I'll go." The voice belonged to Tom Brennan, Tommy's father, a steady man who worked at the lumber mill alongside Ezra. "My boy's alive because of you. If you say there's a way through those mountains, I trust your word. And I'll go too." This from Jake Miller, one of the twin brothers who ran the town's largest stable. "You've been working with us at the mill for weeks now. I've seen how you handle yourself, how you think before you act. That's the kind of man I'll follow into dangerous country." Sarah felt her heart clench as she watched these good men volunteer to follow Ezra into what could easily become a death trap. The rational part of her mind agreed with Richard this was dangerous beyond measure, a desperate gamble that could cost lives rather than save them. But as she studied Ezra's face, saw the calm certainty in his eyes, she found herself believing that if anyone could navigate the treacherous mountain passes in winter weather, it would be this man who'd made those peaks his home for over 2 decades. "When do we leave?" Tom Brennan asked. "First light," Ezra replied. "That gives us time to prepare properly. We'll need specific supplies, specific equipment. And we'll need to accept that even if everything goes perfectly, we might not make it back for a week or more." As the meeting dispersed and families gathered to discuss the implications of this desperate plan, Sarah found herself approaching Ezra near the church door. He was speaking quietly with Tom and Jake, going over details of their journey, but he looked up when she drew near. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" she asked. Ezra nodded to his companions and stepped aside with her, moving into the relative privacy of the church's small vestibule. Up close, Sarah could see the gravity in his expression, the weight of responsibility he was accepting. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. "The town will survive on short rations until the weather breaks and normal supply routes reopen." "Will it?" Ezra asked gently. "What about the children, the elderly? Mrs. Carson's been coughing for weeks. What happens if her medicine doesn't arrive and her condition worsens?" Sarah had no answer for that because he was right. While healthy adults might endure temporary hardship, Cedar Ridge's most vulnerable residents couldn't afford to wait for nature's convenience. But what happens to them if you don't come back? The question slipped out before she could stop it, revealing more of her concern than she'd intended. Ezra studied her face, and Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks under his gentle scrutiny. "Someone else will look after them," he said finally. "Someone always does." "That's not what I meant." Sarah looked down at her hands, surprised by her own boldness. "I meant, what happens to those of us who've grown accustomed to having you here?" When she looked up again, Ezra's expression had softened in a way that made her breath catch. "Sarah," he said quietly, using her given name for the first time. "I've spent 23 years running from anything that might tie me down, anything that might make leaving difficult. But I'm not running anymore." He reached into his jacket and withdrew something that gleamed dully in the church's dim light, a hunting knife in a worn leather sheath, its handle polished smooth by decades of use. "This has kept me alive through more situations than I can count," he said, offering it to her. "I want you to hold on to it while I'm gone, not because I think I won't need it, but because I want you to know I'm coming back to reclaim it." Sarah took the knife with trembling fingers, feeling the weight of both the weapon and the promise it represented. The leather was warm from his body heat, worn soft by his touch, and holding it felt like holding a piece of his certainty, his strength. "I'll keep it safe," she whispered. "I know you will." Ezra smiled then, the kind of smile that transformed his entire face and reminded Sarah that beneath the weathered exterior was a man still young enough to hope for love, for a future that stretched beyond mere survival. As he walked away to prepare for the morning's departure, Sarah stood holding his knife and watching the snow continue to fall outside the church windows. Tomorrow, the man she was finally allowing herself to care for would disappear into the white wilderness, carrying the town's hopes and her heart with him into the unknown. 5 days passed, like an eternity of held breath. Sarah taught her classes with distracted efficiency, led evening prayers for the rescue party's safe return, and found herself touching Ezra's knife through the fabric of her skirt dozens of times each day. The weapon had become her talisman, her tangible connection to a promise that seemed increasingly fragile as the hours stretched into days without word. On the 6th morning, she was grading arithmetic papers when commotion in the street drew her to the schoolhouse window. 3 riders were approaching through the snow, their horses heavy laden with supplies, and even at a distance she could recognize Ezra's straight-backed posture in the saddle. Sarah set down her pen with trembling hands and walked outside, joining the crowd of townspeople who'd begun gathering as word of the men's return spread through Cedar Ridge. Tom Brennan looked exhausted but triumphant. Jake Miller grinned despite his obvious fatigue, but it was Ezra who commanded her, attentionalive, safe, successful in his impossible mission. "They found the wagons," someone called out as the rescue party drew closer. "They brought back the medicine." The celebration that followed was spontaneous and heartfelt. Families embraced their returned men, children cheered, and even the usually reserved members of Cedar Ridge's society seemed caught up in the general relief and gratitude. Sarah hung back, watching as Ezra dismounted and began helping unload the precious supplies, deflecting praise with characteristic modesty. It was then that she overheard the conversation that would change everything. Mr. Patterson, the storekeeper, was speaking with Richard Wesley near the bank's front steps, their voices carrying clearly in the crisp air. "Remarkable thing," Patterson was saying, "how Stone knew exactly where to find those wagons, almost like he'd been through that country before." "More than remarkable," Richard replied, and something in his tone made Sarah pause in her approach. "I had a conversation with the bank in Great Falls yesterday. They finally responded to my inquiry about property ownership in the mountain regions." "Property ownership?" "Stone owns significant acreage up there, thousands of acres, including mineral rights. The man isn't some poor mountain hermits, one of the largest landowners in the territory." Sarah felt the world tilt sideways. The supplies in her hands cookies she'd baked for Ezra's return suddenly felt impossibly heavy. "That can't be right," Patterson protested. "Look at him. His clothes, his manner." "Clothes can be chosen," Richard said smoothly. "Manners can be affected, but land ownership is a matter of public record. Our humble mountain man is worth more than most of the businessmen in this territory." The rest of their conversation faded into meaningless noise as Sarah struggled to process this revelation. Ezra Stone, gentle, modest Ezra, who worked at the lumber mill for daily wages, who wore patched clothes and lived in the boarding house owned vast tracts of valuable land. She thought of their conversations, his careful words about his past, his mother's influence, his years of solitude. Had any of it been true? Or had she been the victim of an elaborate deception, a wealthy man amusing himself by playing poor to test her character? The cookies fell from her numb fingers, scattering in the snow as she turned and fled toward her house. Behind her, the celebration continued, but Sarah heard it as if from a great distance, her mind reeling with questions and doubts that threatened to overwhelm her entirely. At home, she paced her small sitting room like a caged animal, fury and hurt warring in her chest. How dare he lie to her? How dare he let her worry about his future? Let her father warn her about fortune hunters and social climbers, when all the time he possessed more wealth than any of them had imagined. A knock at her door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. Through the lace curtain, she could see Ezra's familiar silhouette, and despite her anger, her heart still leaped at the sight of him safe and whole. "Sarah," his voice carried concern. "I saw you at the celebration, but then you disappeared. Are you all right?" She opened the door with hands that shook with suppressed emotion. Up close, she could see the weariness etched in his features, the toll the dangerous journey had taken, but also the quiet joy in his eyes at seeing her again. "I'm fine," she said stiffly, "though I suppose I should congratulate you on your successful deception." Ezra's expression shifted from joy to confusion. "Deception? Don't." Sarah's voice was sharper than she'd intended. "Don't insult my intelligence by pretending ignorance. I know about your land holdings, your mineral rights. I know you're not the poor mountain hermit you've been pretending to be." The color drained from Ezra's face, and for a moment he looked like a man who'd taken a physical blow. "Sarah, let me explain." "Explain what?" "How amusing it must have been to watch the simple schoolteacher fret about your employment prospects. How entertaining to see her father worry about fortune hunters while you played the part of a humble working man." "It wasn't like that." Ezra's voice was quiet but desperate. "Everything I told you about my past, about my mother, about my years in the mountain soul of that was true. But not complete." Sarah felt tears threaten and fought them back with anger. "You let me think you were poor, that you needed work to survive. You let me worry about your future when you have more security than anyone in this town. Because I learned what happens when people know about the money." Ezra stepped closer, his eyes pleading for understanding. "I learned that wealth changes how everyone sees you, how they treat you. It makes them wonder about your motives, makes them question every kindness. So instead you lied." I omitted. "There's a difference." "Is there?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "You've been testing me, haven't you? Seeing if I'd care for you when I thought you had nothing to offer. What was the plan? Reveal your wealth eventually, and see if I suddenly became more interested." "No." The force of his denial startled them both. "Sarah, I never intended for things to develop this way. I came to Cedar Ridge looking for simple human connection, nothing more. The land, the money, it's just something I inherited, something that's brought me nothing but loneliness." "Loneliness?" Sarah's voice rose. "You chose loneliness. You chose to live alone in the mountains rather than deal with the complications of wealth. And when you finally decided to rejoin civilization, you chose deception as your method." Ezra was quiet for a long moment, his shoulders sagging with defeat. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. 20 years ago, I fell in love with a woman named Catherine, beautiful, intelligent, from a good family. I thought she cared for me, thought we had something real. Then her father died and left debts that would have ruined the family. I offered to help, told her about the land I'd inherited, the money that could solve their problems. Sarah felt her anger begin to waver as she heard the pain in his voice. She married me within a month, Ezra continued, not for love, but for the security I could provide. It took 2 years for me to realize that every kind word, every gentle touch, every declaration of affection was purchased with my wealth. When I finally confronted her, she didn't even try to deny it. So you ran away to the mountains. I ran away from people who saw dollar signs instead of a man. I ran away from women who could calculate my net worth faster than they could tell me their favorite color. He looked at her directly then, and Sarah saw raw vulnerability in his eyes. And when I met you, when I saw how you looked at me before you knew anything about money or land or status, I wanted to protect that. I wanted to know that whatever feelings developed between us were real. Sarah felt her righteous anger crumble in the face of his honesty. She could imagine the young Ezra, trusting and hopeful, being used by someone who saw him as a solution rather than a person. She could understand why he might be cautious about revealing wealth that had brought him only pain. But understanding didn't erase the hurt of discovering that the man she'd begun to love had been hiding fundamental truths about himself. "You should have told me," she said quietly. When you were worried about my finding work, when your father was warning you about fortune hunters, when Richard Wesley was courting you with promises of financial security." Ezra's voice grew desperate. Every conversation we had seemed to prove that money matters more than anything else in this world. "Not to me." "Doesn't it?" He pulled a folded document from his jacket, official-looking papers with territorial seals and legal language. "Here's the deed to my land holdings. 40,000 acres of mountain territory, including mining claims that could be worth a fortune if properly developed. I'm one of the wealthiest men in Montana Territory." Sarah stared at the papers without taking them, her mind struggling to reconcile this revelation with everything she thought she knew about the man before her. "The question is," Ezra continued, his voice breaking slightly, "does knowing that change how you feel about me? Does it make me more attractive, more worthy of your time and attention? Because if it does, then I was right to be afraid, and this conversation proves that whatever I thought was developing between us was just another transaction after all." The train ticket lay on Ezra's small table like an accusation, its crisp edges and official stamp mocking his weeks of hope and careful connection building. One-way passage to Denver, departing Thursday morning. From there, he could disappear into the vastness of the American West, find another mountain range, another place where a man could live alone without explanations or complications. 3 days had passed since his confrontation with Sarah, 3 days of hollow silence where her absence felt like a physical ache in his chest. He'd continued working at the lumber mill, attended church on Sunday, maintained the routines that had begun to feel like belonging, but everything had the bitter taste of ending. The other men at the mill had noticed his distraction, the way he performed his tasks with mechanical precision, but none of his usual engagement. Tom Brennan had tried to draw him into conversation about their successful rescue mission, but Ezra's responses had been brief, distracted. Even Jake Miller, never one to pry into personal matters, had asked if everything was all right. How could Ezra explain that he'd found something precious and lost it through his own fear and deception? How could he describe the look in Sarah's eyes when she'd discovered his lies not just anger, but disappointment so profound it had cut deeper than any accusation? Tuesday evening found him packing his few belongings with the same methodical care he'd once used to prepare for long trapping expeditions. His clothes fit easily into the worn saddlebags that had traveled countless mountain miles. His books few, but treasured wrapped carefully in oiled cloth. The small carved wooden box that held his mother's letters and his father's watch. Everything he'd accumulated during his weeks in Cedar Ridge fit into those same bags, as if his attempt at civilized life had left no lasting mark. The rented room would be clean and empty by morning, ready for the next traveler seeking temporary shelter. A soft knock interrupted his packing. For a moment, hope flared in his chest. Could Sarah have come to boot? When he opened the door, he found Judge Mitchell standing in the hallway, his expression unreadable. "Judge," Ezra stepped back, uncertain. "Is there something I can help you with?" "May I come in?" The older man's tone was courteous but carried the weight of authority that made refusal difficult. Ezra nodded, gesturing him into the small room. Judge Mitchell's gaze took in the packed bags, the train ticket on the table, the general air of departure that pervaded the space. "Running away, Mr. Stone?" The question was direct, cutting through any pretense of social niceties. Ezra had learned to respect the judge's intelligence during their limited interactions, and he saw no point in deflection. "Leaving," he corrected quietly. "There's a difference." "Is there?" Judge Mitchell settled into the room's single chair, his movement suggesting he intended to stay until he'd said his piece. "My daughter is heartbroken. You're fleeing town like a guilty man, and the community that's grown to respect you is about to lose someone they've come to value. Explain to me how this isn't running away." Ezra continued folding shirts, using the mundane task to steady his hands. "Your daughter deserves honesty in a relationship. I failed to provide that. Better to leave now than compound the damage." "You lied to her?" "I omitted important information about my circumstances. In her view, that constitutes deception." Judge Mitchell was quiet for a moment, studying Ezra's careful movements. "You're referring to your land holdings." Ezra's hand stilled. "You know, I make it my business to know about anyone who takes an interest in my daughter. Banking inquiries leave paper trails, Mr. Stone. What surprises me is not that you have money, but that you've chosen to live and work as though you don't. Money complicates things. It changes how people see you, what they expect from you." Ezra resumed his packing, adding his shaving kit to one of the bags. "I wanted to be valued for who I am, not what I own. And you were. My daughter fell in love with a man who risked his life to save a child, who comforted a grieving little girl, who led a dangerous rescue mission to help his neighbors. Your wealth had nothing to do with any of that." The words, "fell in love," hit Ezra like a physical blow. He'd hoped, suspected, but to hear it confirmed by Sarah's father created a pain sharper than any he'd experienced since Catherine's betrayal. "She doesn't trust me now," Ezra said quietly. "She thinks I was testing her, playing games with her emotions. Maybe she's right. Maybe I was so afraid of being hurt again that I created the very situation I was trying to avoid." Judge Mitchell leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Sarah lost her husband 2 years ago. Lost him suddenly, without warning, without the chance to say goodbye. She spent those 2 years learning to live with that kind of pain, and just when she was beginning to hope again, you've confirmed her worst fear, that caring about someone means opening yourself to betrayal." The accuracy of the assessment made Ezra wince. "I never intended to hurt her." "Intentions matter less than actions, Mr. Stone. The question now is what you intend to do about it." Ezra gestured toward the train ticket. "I intend to leave before I cause more damage. Sarah deserves better than a man who lies to protect himself. Sarah deserves a man who fights for her." Judge Mitchell's voice carried the steel that had made him respected throughout the territory. "She deserves someone who stays and faces the consequences of his mistakes, instead of running away when things become difficult. And if she can't forgive me, then you'll have to live with that. But at least you'll have tried to make things right instead of taking the coward's way out." The word coward stung because Ezra recognized its truth. He'd spent 23 years in the mountains, telling himself he was choosing solitude over social complexity. But Judge Mitchell had cut straight to the heart of either'd been running from the possibility of being hurt again. "She won't see me," Ezra said. "I've tried. She has Emma Patterson deliver messages, saying she's too busy to receive visitors." "Have you tried telling her the whole truth? Not just about the money, but about why you were afraid to reveal it? About Catherine? About what happened to make you so cautious about trust?" Ezra's hands stilled on his packing. He'd told Sarah about Catherine during their confrontation, but only the basic facts, not the deeper wounds that had shaped his choices. "Sometimes," Judge Mitchell continued, "the only way to build trust is to make yourself completely vulnerable, to risk everything on the chance that the other person will choose love over self-protection." A commotion in the street below drew their attention to the window. Sarah was walking home from the schoolhouse, her usual route taking her past the boarding house. Even from the second-floor window, Ezra could see the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she avoided looking up at his room. "She's been miserable," Judge Mitchell said quietly. "Throws herself into her teaching, stays late at the schoolhouse, jumps at every unexpected sound, as if she's hoping it might be you coming to apologize properly." "I did apologize. You explained. There's a difference." The judge rose, moving to stand beside Ezra at the window. "She's not angry about the money, son. She's angry about the deception, yes, but mostly she's hurt that you didn't trust her enough to be honest from the beginning." Sarah had paused on the street below, her attention caught by something one of her students was showing her. Even in her sadness, she smiled at the child with genuine warmth, and Ezra felt his heart constrict with longing. "What would you have me do?" he asked. "Stop protecting yourself and start protecting what matters." Judge Mitchell moved toward the door, then paused. "The Harvest Festival is tomorrow night. The whole town will be there, including Sarah. If you're determined to leave, it would be your last chance to say what needs saying. And if she rejects me publicly, then at least you'll know you tried everything." Judge Mitchell's expression softened slightly. "But if you don't try, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been. Trust me, Mr. Stone, that's a heavier burden than any public embarrassment." After the judge left, Ezra stood at his window watching Sarah's house, seeing lamplight bloom in her windows as evening settled over Cedar Ridge. Somewhere in that warm glow, she was grading papers or preparing lessons, going through the motions of her ordered life while carrying pain he'd caused. The train ticket seemed to pulse with possibility-scape, a clean start, freedom from the messy complications of human connection. But as he looked at Sarah's house, at the town that had begun to feel like home, Ezra realized that some things were worth fighting for, even if the battle might end in defeat. He moved to his writing desk and pulled out paper and ink. If tomorrow night was to be his last chance, he needed to find the words to tell Sarah not just what he'd done wrong, but why he'd done it and what she'd come to mean to him in the brief, bright weeks when he'd allowed himself to hope for love again. The letter took him most of the night to write, draft after draft, until he'd found the words that captured everything he needed her to understand. As dawn broke over Cedar Ridge, painting the snow-covered streets in shades of rose and gold, Ezra Stone made his choice. He would stay for the Harvest Festival. He would tell Sarah the complete truth, regardless of the consequences. And if she still couldn't forgive him, he would accept that judgment and find a way to live with it. But he wouldn't run, not anymore. The Harvest Festival transformed Cedar Ridge into something magical. Lanterns strung between buildings cast warm pools of light across the snow, while the scent of roasted chestnuts and mulled cider filled the crisp evening air. The church hall overflowed with families sharing the season's abundant pumpkin pies, cornbread, preserved fruits that would carry them through the long winter ahead. Sarah moved through the celebration with practiced grace, fulfilling her social obligations as one of the festival's organizers. She accepted compliments on the children's recitation, discussed plans for the Christmas pageant, and smiled at appropriate moments, but part of her remained detached, watching the proceedings as if from a great distance. She'd spent the week throwing herself into festival preparations with almost desperate energy, staying late at the schoolhouse to craft decorations, organizing committees with military precision, anything to keep her mind occupied and her heart safely locked away. The work had been a blessing, and a curse it kept her busy, but it also reminded her constantly that Ezra should have been part of these community celebrations. "Sarah, dear, you've outdone yourself this year." Mrs. Henderson, the town's self-appointed social coordinator, appeared at her elbow with her usual enthusiastic approval. "The decorations are simply lovely, and the children's program was delightful." "Thank you." Sarah managed a genuine smile for the older woman's kindness. "Everyone worked very hard. Including you, I suspect. You look tired, dear. Perhaps you should sit down, enjoy the evening, instead of working so hard to make sure everyone else does." Before Sarah could respond, a commotion near the hall's entrance drew their attention. The crowd was parting, conversations pausing, as someone made their way through the gathering. Sarah's heart stopped when she saw Ezra Stone walking toward her, his expression determined but uncertain. He dressed carefully for the occasion, clean clothes that emphasized his broad shoulders and quiet dignity, his hair neatly combed, his beard trimmed. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, the vulnerability there that spoke of a man who'd made a difficult decision and was prepared to face its consequences. "Miss Mitchell." He stopped a respectful distance away, his hat in his hands. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" The entire hall had gone quiet, dozens of pairs of eyes watching this unexpected drama unfold. Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks under the scrutiny, her teacher's instincts rebelling against being the center of such public attention. "Mr. Stone, this isn't the time or place." "Please." The simple word carried such quiet desperation that it cut through her prepared defenses. "I know I have no right to ask, but I'm leaving on the morning train. This is my last chance to say what needs saying." Sarah looked around the hall, seeing her neighbors and friends watching with fascination and concern. Judge Mitchell stood near the refreshment table, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes encouraging. Even Richard Wesley was there, his face showing smug satisfaction at what he clearly expected to be her public rejection of the mountain man's presumption. "Very well." Sarah's voice was steady despite the chaos in her chest. "But make it brief." Ezra nodded, then reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded paper knot, the deed he'd tried to show her before, but something that looked like a letter written in his careful hand. "I wrote this for you," he said, offering it to her. "Everything I should have said from the beginning, everything I was too afraid to risk. But standing here now, seeing you again, I realize that a letter isn't enough. You deserve to hear the words spoken, not just read them." He looked around the quiet hall, meeting the curious gazes of their neighbors with surprising calm. 23 years ago, I fell in love with a woman who saw me as a solution to her family's financial problems. When I discovered that everything between us had been calculated, that every kiss and kind word had been motivated by my bank account rather than my character, it broke something in me that I thought could never be repaired. Sarah felt her breath catch at his raw honesty, the way he was exposing his deepest wounds to a room full of virtual strangers. "I ran to the mountains," Ezra continued, "and I stayed there because I was afraid of being hurt again, afraid of trusting someone enough to let them matter. When I finally came to Cedar Ridge, I told myself I was looking for simple human connection. But the truth is I was terrified that anyone who knew about my circumstances would see me the same way Catherine had as a means to an end, rather than a man worth loving for himself." He turned back to Sarah, and she saw tears gathering in his eyes despite his steady voice. "I should have trusted you with the truth from the beginning. I should have known that the woman who comforts grieving children and worries about her students and sees the best in everyone wouldn't judge me by my bank account. But fear made me stupid, and stupidity made me hurt the one person I'd finally learned to love." The word love hung in the air between them like a bridge neither had been brave enough to cross. Sarah felt her carefully constructed defenses crumbling as she saw the genuine pain in his expression, the way his hands trembled slightly as he held the letter. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Ezra said quietly. "I don't deserve that. But I needed you to know that every moment we shared, every conversation, every smile you gave, none of that was a game or a test. It was the first real happiness I'd known in 23 years, and losing it is the price I pay for my own cowardice." He extended the letter again, his eyes never leaving hers. "This explains everything about Catherine, about the land, about why I was so afraid to be honest. Read it or don't, believe it or don't, but know that it's the complete truth. No more omissions, no more self-protection." Sarah took the letter with hands that shook slightly, the paper warm from his touch. Around them, the hall remained silent, their neighbors caught up in this unexpected drama of love and loss playing out before them. "Ezra," she began, but he shook his head gently. "I won't ask you to trust me again. I broke that trust through my own actions, and I have to live with the consequences. But I wanted you to know that you were worth the risk I was too frightened to take. You were worth everything, and I was too much of a coward to see it until it was too late." Sarah stared at the letter in her hands, feeling the weight of Ezra's words settling around her heart like warmth after a long winter. The hall remained silent, waiting, but she was barely aware of the watching crowd. All her attention was focused on the man before her, on the raw honesty in his voice, and the way he'd stripped away every defense to offer her his complete truth. "You were leaving," she said quietly, the words barely audible in the hushed room. "Without saying goodbye. I thought it would be easier for you if I just disappeared. I thought it would hurt less." Ezra's voice carried the weariness of a man who'd spent days wrestling with impossible choices. "But your father helped me understand that running away wouldn't protect either of us from the pain. It would just mean we'd both have to carry it alone." "My father." Sarah's eyes found Judge Mitchell across the room, saw him nod slightly in acknowledgement. "He pointed out that I was making the same mistake I'd made 23 years ago, choosing self-protection over trust, fear over love." Ezra took a step closer, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. "Sarah, I know I don't have the right to ask for another chance. I know I've broken something precious between us. But I also know that finding you, learning to care about you, has been the best thing to happen to me since my mother died. I can't leave without fighting for that, even if the fight ends in defeat." Sarah looked down at the letter again, then back at his face, seeing the man she'd fallen in love with beneath the pain and uncertainty. The man who'd risked his life to save Tommy, who'd comforted Emma in her grief, who'd led a dangerous rescue mission simply because his neighbors needed help. "You said you loved me." The words slipped out before she could stop them, drawing a collective intake of breath from their audience. "I do." Ezra's response was immediate, unhesitating. "I love your kindness, your strength, the way you see the best in people even when they disappoint you. I love how you make me want to be worthy of your regard, how you've helped me remember that connection is worth the risk of pain. But you didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth." "No." He met her gaze directly, unflinching in his admission. "I didn't. I was so afraid of losing what we had that I guaranteed I would lose it through my own deception. I thought I was protecting us both, but I was really just protecting myself." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she heard the truth in his words, saw the way he accepted full responsibility for his choices without making excuses or shifting blame. This was what she'd needed, not just an apology, but acknowledgement that he understood exactly how his actions had affected her. "The money doesn't matter to me," she said softly. "It never did. But the lies." "I know." Ezra's voice broke slightly. "I know that's what I damaged, and I know how hard it will be to repair. But Sarah, if you'll let me try, if you'll give me the chance to prove that I can be the man you deserve, I swear I'll never hide anything from you again." Around them, the hall remained silent, dozens of people holding their breath as they witnessed this moment of truth between two people their community had grown to care about. Sarah was dimly aware of their scrutiny, but it no longer mattered. All that mattered was the choice before her: hold onto her justified hurt, or risk trusting again. She looked at the letter in her hands, then slowly tore it in half. Ezra's face went white, and she heard several sharp intakes of breath from their audience. But before he could speak, before he could turn away in defeat, Sarah stepped closer and placed her hand on his chest, feeling his heart racing beneath her palm. "I don't need to read your letter," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the silent hall, "because I can see the truth in your eyes. I can hear it in your voice. You're not the same man who deceived me. You're the man who had the courage to come here tonight and risk everything to be honest." Hope flickered in Ezra's expression, but he remained still, afraid to assume too much. "I was hurt," Sarah continued, "not because you had money, but because you didn't trust me with the truth. Because you let me worry about things that didn't matter while hiding something that did. But I understand why you were afraid. I understand what it cost you to trust someone before, and I understand why that made you cautious." She took another step closer, close enough that she could see the hope and fear warring in his eyes. But I also understand that real love requires real trust. Complete honesty, even when it's difficult. Even when it makes us vulnerable. She paused, gathering her courage for what she needed to say next. I love you too, Ezra. I love the man who saved Tommy, who comforted Emma, who risked his life for our community. I love the man who's standing here now, offering me his complete truth, even though he's terrified I'll reject it. The joy that blazed across Ezra's features was like sunrise after the longest night. Sarah, but, she continued, her voice firm despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her, if we're going to try again, it has to be with complete honesty between us. No more omissions, no more self-protection. We both have to be brave enough to trust each other with everything, our fears, our hopes, our complete truths. Yes. Ezra's voice was rough with emotion. Yes, I promise. No more lies. No more hiding. Just the truth, whatever it costs. Sarah smiled then, the first genuine smile she'd felt in days, and reached into her skirt pocket to withdraw something that gleamed dully in the lantern light, his hunting knife, kept safe during their separation. Then you should probably have this back, she said, offering it to him, since you're not leaving after all. Ezra took the knife with reverent hands, but instead of sheathing it, he held it out to her again. Keep it, he said quietly. Not as a promise that I'm coming back, but as a symbol that I'm never leaving again. That whatever comes, we'll face it together. When Sarah took the knife back, their fingers brushed, and she felt the electric connection that had drawn them together from the very beginning. But now it was deeper, more complete, built on truth instead of careful omissions, on trust that had been tested and chosen rather than simply assumed. The hall erupted in applause and cheers as their neighbors finally released the breath they'd been holding. But Sarah barely heard the celebration, barely saw the beaming faces around them. All her attention was focused on Ezra, on the man who'd found the courage to fight for their love instead of running from it. So, she said, having to raise her voice slightly over the ongoing applause, what do we do now? Ezra's smile was radiant, transforming his weathered features with joy. Now we start over, properly this time, with all our cards on the table. All of them. Every single one. He reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, in a gesture that felt both familiar and entirely new. Beginning with the fact that I'd very much like to court you, Miss Sarah Mitchell, with your father's permission and the full knowledge of everyone in this room. Sarah laughed, feeling lighter than she had in days. I think that can be arranged, Mr. Stone. I think that can definitely be arranged. 6 months later, the spring air carried the scent of apple blossoms through the open windows of the schoolhouse, where Sarah sat in the rocking chair that had become as much a part of the building's character as the blackboard and the pot-bellied stove. The chair had been Ezra's first gift after their reconciliation, not expensive or elaborate, but crafted by his own hands from mountain cedar, its runners worn smooth by countless evenings of gentle motion. The final lesson of the day had ended an hour ago, her students scattered to homes and afternoon chores, but Sarah remained, grading papers and enjoying the peaceful rhythm of her new routine. Through the window, she could see the improvements that had transformed Cedar Ridge over the winter months. A new wing on the schoolhouse, funded by an anonymous donor, expanded medical facilities, and the beginnings of a library that would serve the entire territory. The anonymous donor was, of course, no longer anonymous to anyone who mattered. Ezra's wealth had become an open secret in the close-knit community, but it was his character that had earned their respect. He'd used his resources quietly, thoughtfully, always consulting with community leaders about what was truly needed, rather than imposing his own vision of improvement. The sound of familiar footsteps on the porch made Sarah smile before she even looked up. Ezra appeared in the doorway, his work clothes dusty from his continued employment at the lumber miller choice that had puzzled some residents, but one that Sarah understood completely. He needed to work with his hands, needed to feel useful in ways that went beyond writing checks. "Afternoon, Miss Mitchell," he said with mock formality, though his eyes sparkled with the warmth that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. "Mr. Stone." She matched his tone while rising from the rocking chair to greet him properly. "How was your day?" "Productive. Tom Brennan and I finished the new shelving for Patterson's store." He crossed to her, his movements carrying the easy confidence of a man who knew he was welcome. "But more importantly, I have something for you." "Another gift?" Sarah shook her head in gentle exasperation. "Ezra, we've discussed this. You don't need to keep buying me things." "I didn't buy this." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small wooden box, its surface polished to a soft gleam. "I made it." Sarah accepted the box with curious hands, recognizing the same careful craftsmanship that had gone into her rocking chair. The lid opened smoothly to reveal a simple gold band, its surface engraved with tiny wildflowers that matched the pressed aster she still kept in her Bible. "It's not elaborate," Ezra said quietly, his earlier playfulness replaced by nervous sincerity. "No diamonds or fancy settings, just good gold and the promise it represents." Sarah stared at the ring, her heart racing as she realized what he was asking. They'd been courting properly for months, with Judge Mitchell's blessing and the community's approval, but she hadn't allowed herself to assume what the natural progression might be. "Sarah." Ezra's voice was gentle but steady as he took the box from her hands and knelt on the schoolhouse floor. "I know we've both been wounded by love, both learned to be cautious about trusting our hearts to someone else, but I also know that what we've built together is worth whatever risks come with it." He looked up at her, his eyes holding the same vulnerability she'd seen that night at the Harvest Festival, but now tempered with confidence born of months of honest communication and deepening trust. "I love you completely, your strength, your kindness, your patience with a broken-down mountain man who had to learn how to live among people again. You've given me a home, a purpose, a reason to believe that the future can be better than the past." Sarah felt tears gathering as she listened to his carefully chosen words, remembering the lonely woman she'd been just months ago and marveling at how thoroughly her life had been transformed. "Will you marry me?" Ezra asked simply. "Will you take the risk of building a life with someone who promises to love you honestly, completely, for whatever time we're given?" "Yes." The word came out as barely a whisper, then stronger as joy overwhelmed her caution. "Yes, of course I'll marry you." Ezra's hand shook slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger, the simple band settling into place as if it had always belonged there. When he rose and pulled her into his arms, Sarah felt the last of her carefully guarded reservations melt away. Their kiss was gentle, reverent, full of promise and the kind of deep contentment that comes from finding exactly where you belong. Around them, the schoolhouse held their happiness like a blessing, sunlight streaming through windows onto worn wooden floors that had witnessed countless lessons about hope and new beginnings. "Mrs. Stone," Ezra murmured against her hair, testing the sound of it. "Not yet," Sarah laughed, pulling back to look at his face. "But soon." "How soon?" "Well, we'll need time to plan properly. There's the church to reserve, invitations to send, address to—" Sarah. Ezra's interruption was soft, but decisive. "I've waited 23 years for you. I've spent months learning to court you properly, to earn your father's respect and the community's approval, but I don't want to wait any longer than absolutely necessary to call you my wife." Sarah studied his face, seeing the combination of patience and urgency there, understanding that this wasn't impatience, but recognition of how precious their time together was. 2 months, she said finally. That's enough time to do things properly without unnecessary delay. 2 months. Ezra's smile was radiant. I can manage 2 months. As evening settled over Cedar Ridge and they walked home together through streets that had become as familiar as family, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The mountain man who'd ridden into town, seeking simple human connection, had found love instead. The widowed schoolteacher who'd thought her heart was safely buried with her first husband had discovered that it was capable of growing larger, not smaller, when shared with someone worthy of trust. Behind them, The schoolhouse stood quiet in the gathering dusk, its windows dark, but the rocking chair on the porch still moving slightly in the evening breeze. Tomorrow would bring new lessons, new challenges, new opportunities to serve their community together. But tonight was for plans and promises, for two people who'd learned that the best things in life were worth waiting for, worth fighting for, and worth the risk of opening your heart completely to another human being. The pressed wildflower in Sarah's Bible had long since crumbled to dust between the sacred pages, but the love it had symbolized had taken root and flourished into something far more enduring than any single blossom. Like the mountains that had sheltered Ezra through his years of solitude, like the schoolhouse that had given Sarah purpose during her time of grief, their love had become a landmark, permanent, reliable, a place of shelter and strength that would endure whatever storms the future might bring.